At the end of the day, the problem is that the United States cannot and does not want to legitimately compete with China and Africa. It wants to just see that relationship stop because it feels so insecure about its position on the African continent, because it knows that the way that it has cemented itself on the African continent is so fragile. I mean, look at just disaster. Look at what's happened in Niger. I mean, literally, the United States trained the leadership that has taken power in Niger through the U.S. Africa Command.
Yep.
And, well, some might say, oh, well, the United States didn't seem to have a problem. Maybe it'll just do the U.S. bidding. Maybe, but the United States wouldn't send Victoria Nuland to Niger to talk to the leadership if it didn't feel like there might have been something to worry about there. So all this is to say is that the United States is incredibly fragile on the African continent, and it can't lash out in the way that it wants because it doesn't want to look like a neo-colonial power. It certainly does not want to look like that. I mean, look at what's going on with regard to Palestine right now. It's a disaster for the United States. Joe Biden could literally have sunk his entire campaign because he cannot seem to let go of, even just for a moment, this total unconditional support for the Zionist regime that is committing genocide. That he cannot do it. He doesn't want to do it. But you would think the historical moment would call for, well, you got an election in November, dude. You might not want to have tens of thousands of Palestinian blood on your hands, given that in key areas of the United States, there's a lot of Arab Americans. Hell, there's a lot of young people. You see the big protests out there. Those young people would probably vote for you if they had a choice between you and Donald Trump. Like if a gun was put to their head, they'd probably vote for you. But will they now? Probably not. So, that is, all this is to say is that the relationship between China and Africa is just one example, I think, of a larger problem for the United States, is that it cannot compete. Those who control economic development in the United States, which is mainly finance capital, they don't want to compete. They just want to suck everything dry. They just want everything.
So some people accuse China of exploiting Africa for resources, much like the West. What would you say to others who see China as a problem in Africa more than a friendly partner?
Yeah. So, I mean, first, for people, if you're in the West and your inclination is to condemn China for having relationships, pretty strong and robust relationships at this point, with the majority of African countries, and that's your first entrance into understanding Africa and its history, then I don't know what to say. Then I feel sorry for you, because that shows how misinformed and how misinformed you are, but also how erased the history of African development and the development of African nations as a whole has been. But in terms of what would I say? I would say that, and it's really interesting that there's always something going on outside of my window. A couple of days ago, there was it's like a car crash every week outside of my apartment. But anyway, back to the topic. The point is that if you're going to look at China, Africa from the lens of the Western mainstream media, which is what the majority of people are doing, because most people don't have any other avenues for learning about this. So they'll pull up their phone, they'll go into maybe they have a subscription to New York Times, or even if they they have an Android or an iPhone, it doesn't even matter anymore. They go into their news. Usually all phones have these news things. They'll look at an article and they'll say, oh, debt trap diplomacy, right? China's doing debt trap diplomacy in Africa. That's usually what they'll say. They'll read the article and they'll say, damn, China's so messed up, right? Like, they're messed up. They are impoverishing the African continent, African nations, using loans and assistance and development assistance. And what's interesting is that the propaganda war on China has been so intense that people don't see that as kind of strange, right? This idea that development assistance and loans, that these things are the reason why African countries are impoverished, right? They don't see that as weird.
Yeah, like they've
Because
never heard of the IMF or the World Bank.
yes,
It's like,
because it's as
I've never
if
heard of those.
yes, it's as if there hasn't been a historical precedent for this. That is, as you said, JB, you know, the Western financial system through the Bretton Woods institutions, mainly the IMF and the World Bank, which have a long history of using so-called development assistance to essentially act as a cover for plunder and to open up, so to speak, African countries to full-scale privatization and, of course, the corporate dominance, the dominance of Western corporations needed to get there. So that's number one. But then, you know, some people say, oh, that's whataboutism. Well, then, okay, if it's not whataboutism, it's not, oh, well, look at what the IMF and the West has done. Well, then actually study what China has done. And there's actually pretty mainstream sources now, even if you just do a rudimentary search on China-Africa relations. Like you could say, you could even Google search, is China using debt trap diplomacy in Africa? And you might find research and articles from people like Deborah Brottigam, who is a researcher from Johns Hopkins University, who founded this China-Africa research group. She's written books, for example, The Dragon's Gift, which is a great book. It's old, it's 2009, but it's all about China's relationship to Africa. And what she finds, because she's traversed the African continent, she studied the projects, what she finds is that actually there is no debt trap diplomacy. There's no attempts to destroy African countries through lending assistance. What she actually finds is that these projects, when they are able to happen, actually have benefit for the African country, the economy in question, and China as well. And they mainly focus on irrigation and developing agricultural advances and because a lot of the African continent is still very rural and agrarian, developing electricity and things like that on the African continent, railways, etc. And then when she looked at these projects, she saw that actually there is no debt trap. China is not, most of the loan arrangements, most of the agreements actually have pretty specific clauses and conditions that allow these countries to have huge grace periods, low interest, and even in some instances to have those debts forgiven entirely when certain circumstances come up. And we saw that China forgave, I believe it was 19 African countries' debt during the COVID. 17 countries during the COVID-19. Oh, there it is. COVID-19 crisis. And so just one example, there's the Entebbe, I'm probably butchering the name, the Entebbe airport in Uganda. That was said to be a huge example. I believe this was in 2021 or 2020. I think it was 2021 or 2022. The Western mainstream media put out a story and said, Uganda had to close its international airport, the Entebbe airport, because it didn't pay back its loans to China. And then when you read through the lines, what you actually find is that, one, the airport is not closed. It hasn't been shut down. But number two, that the arrangement, the loan that was given to Uganda to build the airport, or to help build the airport, happened in 2015 with a 7-year grace period, meaning that when the story was released, Uganda literally had to pay $0 or zero, whatever, RMB, whatever it was, zero back to China for that project because there was a grace period. Uganda didn't have to pay anything if it didn't want to, whatever. So all this is to say is that most of what we hear about debt trap diplomacy and China undermining African sovereignty, the vast majority of it, if not all of it, is fabrication. And
Mm,
the reality is that for whatever complexities there are in China-Africa relationships, unevenness, issues of any sort, it has to do with the fact that in any kind of partnership, some things are going to be done better by one country, and some things are going to be done better by the other. And sometimes it's not a good fit. So Deborah Brautigam found many instances, and when she talked about projects in her book, many of like abandoned projects, like China would help build, for example, in Sierra Leone, like an irrigation a project to help develop farming there. She would find, oh, well, a year or two later, after the Chinese left, the project was not happening anymore. Like why wasn't it happening? Well, because there were government issues, internal politics, because there was, without Chinese assistance, there wasn't the ability to maintain it. So there's a lot, whatever issues do come about between China and African countries that it does business with, those issues are because each country is navigating their own strengths and their own weaknesses. And it's
mhm,
not a matter of, is China trying to steal everything? Certainly the relationship is mutual, is benefiting China, because it is about both sides, China and whatever African country in question. It's about both of them benefiting. China's not doing this for charity or to, it's
mhm,
not doing this out of some kind of hope that it can just lift up African countries, that kind of thing. No, African countries have certain needs. All of them are underdeveloped at this point. The United States destroyed the most prosperous of African countries in Libya.
yeah.
And so all African countries are underdeveloped, impoverished, have been, unfortunately, despite the vast wealth that sits underneath, or that sits within each respective country, all of those borders of which were drawn by the West, were drawn by colonial powers. Those
Mhm,
countries, they look at China and they say, well, okay, China has high technology. They have all this infrastructure. They have the ability to help us build electrical lines, ports, all these things that we need, roads, railroads, all these things that we need in order to integrate our economies and to develop industry and to raise the standard of living of African people, and to stabilize, even if it's just narrow interest for a particular African country, is to stabilize the situation, to make sure the economy is stable. Regardless of what it is, that's how African countries look at China. And China sees Africa, of course, as a vast, um, resource rich continent. But it also has, and this is true, I think, on both sides, there's also a bigger part of this relationship that tends to get undermined, which is that China and Africa, since the Cold War especially, have a strong relationship when it comes to politics and their histories. China and many African countries see a relationship between what they had to experience from outside powers. African continent was carved up, um, by the West, and China was humiliated by the West, right? Like they both have that. They both have this kind of colonial legacy that
mhm,
they share. So a
yeah.
lot of African countries, I mean, my friend Jing Li, who works at CGTN, she recently did a video on the Tanzam Railway, which was built in the early 1970s, before opening up and reform, before the there was really any Chinese industry, so to speak. It was very rudimentary still at that point. But still, China sent its workers, its whatever technical know-how it had. It sent people to Tanzania and to Zambia to build a railway that connects the two, and it still exists to this day. And it was one of the first. I believe it was one of the first railroad projects ever, one of the first rail systems ever on the African continent that was built by China. So they have this relationship of solidarity as well, which often gets negated. And now we see that relationship really, I think, in our face more and more as African countries become less and less satisfied with how the United States treats them. The president of Ghana, for example, I believe it went viral when he confronted Kamala Harris and said, hey, don't talk to us about China because we're not here to do that. And the reason for that confrontation was because the United States tends to like to travel to African countries and get them into back rooms, get their leaders into back rooms and say, hey, you shouldn't be trading with China as much. And the African country says, oh, will you help us more? Will you trade with us more? And the United States was, well, no, not really. We have a military base for you. We have the U.S. Africa Command for you. We have counterterrorism for you. And we have a very small amount of development assistance, which will be led by nefarious organizations like USAID and spearheaded by major corporations and their think tanks to essentially steal what you have. And it'll only be, well, I think the U.S. trade volume, U.S. economic trade volume in Africa is something like $40 to $60 billion, something very low. In China, I think it's close to 300 billion at this point. So there's a discrepancy about which power in this situation makes the most sense for African countries and African nations, and it's China. So that is all to say that it's important to first look at the lies that we're being told. Debt trap diplomacy with regard to China is just literally a lie. First of all, you can't put debt trap and diplomacy together and act like they stand together. There's no diplomacy if there's a debt trap. That's literally economic warfare. And who knows best about economic warfare? It's the United States, which sanctions over 30 countries around the world, and in attempts to starve them into submission, and creates major havoc and chaos and literal death in Syria and many other places. Like, people die in the thousands and the millions because of sanctions. So then we have to look at, well, what are the relations exactly between China and African countries? And they tend to be a lot friendlier, a lot warmer than you would expect from what you've heard in the Western mainstream media. And that's because, on the one hand, China has a lot to offer. African countries have a lot to offer. So it makes a lot of sense for them to do business together. Africa has a lot of wealth that has been untapped, that needs to be developed, and African countries have for so many years. This is a decades-long process. This is what all African revolutionaries, all independence movements that were worth any of their salt have said. It's, we need to develop our wealth in order to make this particular African country, whether we're about Ghana or Zimbabwe, anything, we need to make our country wealthy for African people. And the only way you do that is by building industry, developing the productive forces similar to, like, let's say China, so that your natural resources actually go to the needs that your particular society has. So African countries have that, and they have a lot of untapped wealth that China can use to help sustain its industrial economy. And China now has such a big economy that it needs to send off economic development, certain sectors of its economy to Africa to build these projects, because it helps release pressure from China's economy, and it helps to not just ensure that China grows richer, but then it also provides, it also helps raise the standard of living of African countries, and that in effect only can help China, because the richer everyone gets, the more that the trade relations bring breakthroughs that that can really address problems, like the ability for example, African countries to get renewable energy from China, then ensures that there can be more countries in the in the arena figuring out, well, how do we have industrialized economies that generate wealth for people, and also not destroy the natural world that we live in, which unfortunately for a lot of the African continent has happened because of the way that the West chose to force Africa into developing. A lot of, just a lot of waste in, it's just a lot of African countries, unfortunately, have to deal with huge problems like mono agriculture and the decimation of natural life because of the way that the West has sought to steal its resources. I mean, the things that happen in countries like Niger, I mean, it's disgusting when you think about it, like the oil spills and the things that happen because of the way that the West has attempted to maintain its dominance over these African countries and their resources still holds consequences to this day. So China certainly is not the problem there. And whatever problems do arise in the China-Africa relationship mainly have to do with how bilaterally those countries are dealing with unevenness, both internally and between each other, because that's just the reality. They're not going into this with everything figured out. They have needs that sometimes can't be met. They have issues that sometimes are irreconcilable to making a project happen, and that's where mainly the problems happen. But
Hmm.
surely it has no bearing on the relationship as a whole. Like African countries don't say, "Oh, child, that project failed because China was, trying to screw us." No, that's never how it's looked at. It's looked at, well, that project failed because we just couldn't do it. Maybe China didn't have the capital, maybe we didn't have the labor, maybe we didn't have these tools, maybe they didn't have the tools that we needed. That's generally how it works.
Hmm. That was a great also explanation. And one of the things that I want to definitely say is thank you for that, because a lot of times you get a lot of people who will look at it from when they say about Africa, they'll say, well, Africa is being exploited, and they're saying it from about in regards to China. To be honest with you, it feels like pure projection from the West to say that, because if they're saying that, then because the way I look at it, and I spoke about this when I spoke to Chairman Omali Yeshitela, was from what it looks like, it's China's relationship with African countries is more of a patron and a shopkeeper type of relationship. Like, oh, you have lithium. Let me purchase this lithium from you. And what is your rate? And then I will purchase that from you. Oh, you need some shelves built? Okay, let me help you build those shelves so you can store more of these things on your shop, right? Versus the United States is, boom, give me all your money. And if you can cooperate, I might just let you live. And that's how basically it feels like to me where the relationship is. So whereas China's looking at, oh, this patron, I'm sorry, whereas Africa's coming in and saying, oh, this patron is coming to buy from me and see what I have in stock. The United States is coming in like a mafia going, God, it'd be a shame if you lost this store. Maybe, just maybe, you should give us a little bit of what you got already, and we might just let you stick around. So that's what it feels like.
Yeah, I mean, when it is pure projection, because
Yeah.
when has the United States, they talk about the airport, right? The Tembe airport in Uganda. When has the United States built an airport on the African continent for the specific purpose of helping a country like Uganda increase its trade revenue, its tourism revenue, all of that? When has it ever done such a thing? It doesn't do that. What the United States does is it says exactly what you said. It's, yeah, we can offer counterterrorism, we can offer U.S. African Command, we can offer you a military base, and oh, here's some small amounts of economic assistance, which is mainly going to go to our corporation so they can come extract your resources and we can take it to some other country. I mean, France does this in Niger, and we
Mhm.
can, we can control your economy, and that's about it. That's about what we offer. So the projection certainly is that the United States, yes, does what they accuse China of doing. That's what the United States does. And the interesting thing now, and I think the reason why Africa comes up so much, is because the
Mhm.
United States has a lot of insecurity about this issue. So the United States, no no shocker here. The United States, the ruling class, the neocons, all the people who control foreign policy, who control how the U.S. relates to the world, it feels
Mm-hmm.
incredibly small on the African continent. The United States came to the game late when it comes to Africa anyway, because during the independence movements of the 20th century, the United States was in a delicate position during the Cold War, and it didn't
Mm-hmm.
want to be seen as a new colonial power. So what it attempted to do was use the bare minimum of means to undermine any kind of problematic independence forces, and then pivot to where it felt it was most important economically to pivot to, and that was never the African continent. The United States never viewed the African continent as an important place. It was too underdeveloped, and by the time the United States got into the game, we're talking the 1960s, really, 1970s. The United States wasn't really in a position to say, okay, well, we're going to invest a whole lot of resources to then extract what Africa has for us. No, it was going to use what was already ready made, the European colonial system turned neocolonialism to have that happen. That's why, I mean, that's why you still have a situation where France is mainly the most influential economic player in West Africa, right? It's not the United States. And why
Yeah.
is that? Because the United States was like, oh, no, no, no. We'll let them do their thing. And then whatever Europe, however Europe benefits from it, there are junior partners anyway. They're under our thumbs. We'll benefit from it, indirectly. So the United
Yeah.
States never put in the energy economically. It never had interest to do that. It always viewed Africa as a chip in a Cold War, in a conflict with bigger fish that it wanted to fry in the Pacific with China, the Soviet Union, and Eurasia. That's where it focuses energy is in relation to Africa. So by the time China started to, in the late um, 20th century, early 21st century, start to look at the African continent as an economic partner,
Mm-hmm.
the United States was not even paying attention. So
Gotcha.
suddenly, as China was building up its economy, as the United States started to raise eyebrows and say, wow, China's growing pretty fast. Maybe one
Mm-hmm.
day China will be viewed as a competitor to us. By the time that happened, China and Africa were already very close economically, and it's
Mm-hmm.
only gotten stronger as the United States has looked more and more like a pariah that it is around the world
Oh,
in the economic sphere, right? Like, what does it truly have to offer? It goes in, the G7 conference in 2022. You remember they had this huge, we're gonna compete with the Belt and Road Initiative, and we're going to pour, what was it, $600 billion. Nothing happens, right? Nothing happens. $600 billion poured between these Western countries and, of course, the vassal Japan, and we're gonna compete with the Belt and Road Initiative. And then at the latest G20, they said, oh, we'll do this Middle East, India, Europe corridor to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative. Well, nothing happened at the 2022 G7 summit. And then 2023, they announced this corridor. And then the United States says, oh, to hell with it. We'll just back Israel's genocide. And guess what that means? No corridor, because you can't have a corridor going from, you can't have a India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor if you have a literal genocide and a possible regional war happening in the exact region where that corridor is supposed to run through.
oh
And
God.
diplomatically and politically, it's a non-starter now, because guess what? The least that even the most reactionary Arab monarchies, the most vassalized, the most subservient Arab monarchies can do in the region is to not go really fast to build up a corridor, an economic corridor with the United States that really wasn't going to generate much benefit anyway. And also, that corridor, if you look at the map, and there were some maps being shared of what it would look like, there are many points where Belt and Road Initiative projects developed by China in partnership with a particular country were going to be the cross-through points, meaning that corridor was going to have to use Belt and Road infrastructure anyway in order to work. For example, the port of Piraeus in Greece was part of this India, Middle East, Europe corridor to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative. It was going to use Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure. So that just goes to show, one, how China's Belt and Road Initiative and its economic development, assistance, and cooperation with the world is viewed much more favorably by the vast majority of the world, the global South, Africa included, and that the United States has essentially already fallen so far behind that it can't catch up even if it wanted to, which it doesn't, and it can't. Can you imagine the United States saying, "Oh yeah, we're going to up our trade revenue or trade volume with Africa by 5 times, 6 times in order to meet the challenge of China"? Absolutely not. What would that mean? It would mean you'd have to engage with Ghana, with Mali, with all these countries in Africa who are saying, "Oh well, we need a stadium over there, a road over there, we need a rail system over here." You think the United States is going to build that with
No.
what? They don't even build that here. The United States doesn't even build that here. They've been talking about a high-speed rail in California. That's never happening. Like there's no interest in it. Why is that? It's because the United States long ago, based on what really was, it wasn't some kind of coup. It wasn't some kind of, oh, well, the big evil people at Wall Street just destroyed industry. No, not really. It was a progression of the U.S.'s economic system from one that was more industrialized in the past. Now it is dominated by finance, and all finance cares about, finance capital, all they care about is how to make money, how to make as much money for themselves, how to make money on top of money, and how they can do that using as little money as possible. And so if you have that equation, that means all you can get is austerity, all you can get is debt, all you can get is war, because if you invest some in war, you might be able to get more money from that investment, because hey, there's a lot of wars that can be waged in order, and the more that you wage war, the more unstable the world becomes, and then you can swoop in and steal more from from others. I mean, that's what finance capital literally does. It swoops in and steals once the wars or amid the wars being waged. So that is kind of the equation that we live under, and when it comes to the United States' economic system. So it's just, as you said, it's complete projection, and that projection does expose a fundamental weakness, which is that there really is no competing. You had heard Gavin Newsom. He went to China. He visited many cities. He was in Beijing. He said very lovely things about China. And one of the things he said was, when China, if China is doing well, the whole world does well, right? Like that's what he said. The problem is that he doesn't understand that the United States cannot, he even said something to the effect of, well, it's like diversification. I don't want to decouple. I think we should diversify, because if we diversify, then, and we compete, as you said, almost like I'm like alluding to what you said in terms of earlier, in terms of everyone compete. Like if we compete to do really good things, then maybe the world would be a better place. Like if we competed to end climate catastrophe, environmental catastrophe, if we competed to alleviate poverty, all those things, like, yeah, you could have a really good world. The problem is that the United States, its economy, finance that dominates it, it sees competition as a huge problem, and it also sees competition as merely an engine to fuel zero-sum games, because the only way that finance can reproduce itself is by getting bigger, monopolizing more, and ensuring that any competitor eventually loses. So it's never about, oh, sometimes we lose, sometimes they lose. It's not a game of basketball to them. It's not. Kevin Durant said recently, he was like, oh, you're going to find out that you compete harder amongst friends, right? I think that's a pretty interesting little factoid, because the media always says NBA players why are they so nice to each other? Why do they like each other? I don't want to see that on the court. And that's because, they want to see these aggressive black men, competing against each other, and it's so good for sales, that kind of thing. But I think we can kind of look at the world situation like this. Like, surely you could compete and you could do really great things if you're friends, right? Like, if you're friends, if you're friendly, if you have good relations, then surely everyone can benefit and you can still compete. It's not like it's not a completely communist world order. So you can still compete around things and see who ends out on, see who wins, see who loses. But it generally means no one loses. So at the end of the day, the problem is that the United States cannot and does not want to legitimately compete with China and Africa. It wants to just see that relationship stop because it feels so insecure about its position on the African continent, because it knows that the way that it has cemented itself on the African continent is so fragile. I mean, look at just disaster after look at what's happened in Niger. I mean, literally, the United States trained the leadership that has taken power in Niger through the U.S. Africa Command.
Yep.
And, well, some might say, oh, well, the United States didn't seem to have a problem. Maybe it'll just do the U.S. bidding. Maybe, but the United States wouldn't send Victoria Nuland to Niger to talk to the leadership if it didn't feel like there might have been something to worry about there. So all this is to say is that the United States is incredibly fragile on the African continent, and it can't lash out in the way that it wants because it doesn't want to look like a neo-colonial power. It certainly does not want to look like that. Look at what's going on with regard to Palestine right now. It's a disaster for the United States. Joe Biden could literally have sunk his entire campaign because he cannot seem to let go of, even just for a moment, this total unconditional support for the Zionist regime that is committing genocide. That he cannot do it. He doesn't want to do it. But you would think the historical moment would call for, well, you got an election in November, dude. You might not want to have tens of thousands of Palestinian blood on your hands, given that in key areas of the United States, there's a lot of Arab Americans. Hell, there's a lot of young people. You see the big protests out there. Those young people would probably vote for you if they had a choice between you and Donald Trump. Like, if a gun was put to their head, they'd probably vote for you. But will they now? Probably not. So, that is, all this is to say is that the relationship between China and Africa is just one example, I think, of a larger problem for the United States, is that it cannot compete. Those who control economic development in the United States, which is mainly finance capital, they don't want to compete. They just want to suck everything dry. They just want everything. They don't want to compete. They want to see China fall because they think if China falls, then hell, look at that huge industry they can just gobble up. There's a lot of wealth to gobble up. That's why George Soros is one of the biggest opponents of China's current political and economic trajectory under Xi Jinping. And why is that? Because he thought, he completely misread. He doesn't understand jack nothing about China. He thought that under Deng Xiaoping in 1978, that China was opening up. This is what a lot of these people thought. China's opening up. They're going to give us everything. And they didn't get it. But they didn't mind because China had a really large, cheap labor force at the time. And through economic cooperation, they could let off a lot of steam, pressure on their own economies as they were making a transition to neoliberal finance capitalism. That's the reason why China wasn't, there was a Tiananmen Square incident, which one of Soros's foundations was involved in trying to foment. But all in the main, U.S. capital, the rich, didn't see China as a fundamental problem. They saw it as a weak country that was giving a lot of benefits to the United States.
Even in
Xi
the
Jinping
90s,
comes
right,
around.
with NAFTA.
Yeah, like 90s. China was able to get into the World Trade Organization, that kind of thing. They saw China's benefiting us, we're getting rich because of China, so we're not going to shake things up too hard, despite the fact that there were still criticisms of the Communist Party. You'd still get the stories about repression,
Hmm.
authoritarianism, all that stuff. It's not like that stuff didn't exist, but during the 80s, 90s, early 21st century, it was less prevalent. And of course, when the Obama administration rolled around, there was a reason why there was a pivot to Asia toward the second half of his second term. And that's because China's leadership under Xi Jinping, although I think people overstate that it was like a Xi Jinping changed the calculus for good. It was really that China was at a different stage of its development and was ready to become more assertive, not in terms of power projection and not in terms of threatening US national interests and freedom of navigation. All this is nonsense. It was really that China's economy was ready to take the next step and was moving out of small to medium size into large and advanced in terms of its productive forces. It was no longer just pushing out cheap outputs for the collective West to take advantage of. It was now
Yeah.
developing advanced technology. Wages were higher. Workers. Apple's CEO has said on the record that China is not a country where you go for cheap labor anymore, because China has not just higher wages than most countries in the global south, if not all of them, but it also has just an incredibly educated workforce, high levels of education and engineering, science, technology, all those things that are degrees higher now than the collective West. So that's why you go to China rather than to just make a lot of money off of workers who arguably, at least for the currency that Chinese workers get from factory work, are pretty high at this point.
Mhm.
When I'm in China, people always say, "Oh yeah, it's hard to get workers to not work a lot of hours in factories in China because they want to like work 6 months out of the year because they're going to be making like, you know, 100, 200, 300,000 RMB, and then they're gonna, and then they're gonna be good." Like that's what, but they're working a lot, and so there's some problems with that, and that's one of the things that they have to deal with. But in any event, it's because China is not a low wage country anymore. It's because China has developed in the way that it has. And it's because it's ready to be more assertive, and that countries are looking toward China and the global south as a potential alternative, because its foreign policy has always been, but now it's just more important that it is,
Mhm.
it's about non-interference. It's about ensuring that the independence, the sovereignty of other countries is respected. It's about mutuality and win-win cooperation, because its foreign policy is defined by that. That at this point, given the huge laundry list of crimes that the United States has committed because of the image the United States has built up around the world over the course of many decades,
Mhm.
well, now there are choices. And so the United States pivoted to Asia, pivoted to China in many cases to ensure that, one, it would never be number two, because the United States, despite literally being the number two of the world, for lack of a better terms, as a in terms of its economy, in terms of who rules it, in terms of the outcomes and the conditions that are produced by its social order. Just, it can't handle being number two, and it can't also allow for the the country, the nation that surpasses it, to chart a different path. To do
Yeah.
it. For China in particular, a country that has a long history of being looked at by the United States longer than the Chinese Revolution. And we're talking, you know, the century of humiliation period during the Chinese immigration to the United States. I mean, China was looked at as literally the S-hole of the world. That's how people in the United States have been taught, the sick man of Asia, all this stuff, yellow peril. That is how the United States' ruling class has always viewed China. And when it
Mhm.
became a socialist country, it became a double threat. And then now that it's neither, you can't even think about it without looking ridiculous, calling it the sick man of Asia anymore. And now that it's in that position, it has to be stopped. And so that's why the China-Africa relationship, to stop my rant, is such a problem to the United States.
Yeah, yeah. It kind of feels like you have this big kingdom, and then they have this peasant over here, and they're like, "Oh, we're gonna pay you this pittance to work for us." And then the peasant works, then scurries back into the forest, comes back, works some more, get his pay, and then it happens over and over. Next thing you know, you look up and you see through the trees, and you're like, "Wait a minute, is that a castle through the trees I see getting built over there? Wait a minute." What the hell just going on here? Then next thing you know, you consider him a threat because they've been taking your money and then building up their shit. And now look, they got a castle that's rivaling yours, and all because you underestimated them. That's what it feels like from the United States, because it's just like the United States is scratching their head like, how did they do this? And that's when China goes, socialism, baby. And it's hilarious how the United States, in their own hubris, just looked at China and saw, oh, well, they're just skinny little wrinkly kid that can't do anything. Next thing you know, and then you had them working your field all this time. Next thing you know, China comes in, boom, 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 boom. And China's like, hey, what's good? What's good, Holmes? Next thing you know, they're like, wait, how did they get this muscular? How did they get this big? Well, you've been having me lift all your shit for you.
Yeah.
Guess what?
I mean,
now look at me.
The United States has a huge habit. I mean, if there's one point to push hard when it comes to geopolitics, is understanding the U.S.'s role in the world. It's understanding that the United States, especially after it became the so-called global hegemon, but even before that, but especially after the World War II, the United States has a habit. It can't help it because of the hubris, as you said. That word hubris is important because the hubris of the United States, the so-called American exceptionalism, it's so intense. I mean, it is really what I would call, for lack of a better word, an advancement. Not really an advance in terms of progress, but literally an intensification of that larger Western exceptionalist, Western navel gazing, the West versus the rest, the West is the best, all of that. There is nothing more intense than American exceptionalism as an ideology built on hubris. And so the United States, its ruling elite, its foreign policy establishment, all of it has always had a huge habit of underestimating those it views as an adversary. I was just in Vietnam, and if we're talking about underestimation, I mean, the United States literally thought it could destroy an entire people through conventional warfare when they were fighting guerrilla warfare. So if you think you can destroy an entire people fighting a guerrilla war for their own country and their own independence and their own right to live and to develop how they want to do it, and you're going to do that through conventional means, dropping bombs on them, invading them, dropping chemicals on them, Agent Orange. If you think you're going to win doing that, you have a whole other thing coming. It's similar to Israel. Israel thinks it can win and defeat the Palestinians by killing them all. You're not going to win by killing them all, because eventually they're going to fight a guerrilla war, i.e. kind of what happened on October 7th, and they're going to be able to eventually build up forces, and there will be a point in time where there will be a reckoning, and it doesn't take much, right? It didn't take much for Israel to go rampantly genocidal and increase what already was a genocidal campaign, right? It didn't really take much. It took a day of open warfare where they were supposedly taken off guard and they couldn't fight and fend it off to the point where it didn't cause an international scandal. So it didn't take much. And it doesn't take, it took many years probably for October 7th to happen for Palestine. And it took many years for Vietnam to oust the United States. But it happened. And the United States underestimated the people of Afghanistan. They thought they were going to occupy that place forever. And they were going to control it forever. And then one day they were running into their damn fighter jets trying to get the hell out. They were trying to helicopter the entire U.S. occupation force out of there because they were being chased down by, allegedly the Taliban, but I'm sure it was a lot of ordinary Afghans who took up arms to oust the occupation force. The same goes for Korea. They thought, oh, we're gonna go in here and we're just gonna make quick work. They were in Korea for 3 years and they had to end in a stalemate because they could not take over the North. They could not do it. They couldn't do it. It was not possible. They destroyed the entirety of the north of Korea, and still they couldn't win. So underestimating the adversary is a highlight of the United States' foreign policy. Russia, the same way. They thought Putin's going to fall the next day after we slap 1,000 sanctions on him and on Russia. No, actually, Russia's economy has been able to reorient in a way where it was actually, it's actually growing faster than much, if not all, of Western Europe at this point. So the underestimation, you can go on, I can go on and on and on, but it's just a highlight. And I think it shows how when you are a hegemon, when you are sitting at the top of an empire, you can't see what's actually happening underneath you. And what's actually happening underneath you is that people in nations are trying to get out from underneath you. And generally history shows that they eventually win. And so your days of number, and that's what the United States is so worried about. They're worried about it in the war on terror. That was a lot of the reason the war on terror was fought. It wasn't, 9/11. It was, oh, wow, there's still Syria, there's still Iran, there's still Iraq, there's still these countries that maybe one day, if they're able to modernize, they're able to continue on their path, they're kind of going to be completely independent of our our financial system. And oh, wow, they have a lot of resources. If they're independent of our financial system, then our financial system is completely effed. So that's why General Wesley Clark, talked to Donald Rumsfeld and he said, oh, we want that country gone, Libya, Syria, Lebanon, Iran. Like, what are all these countries? Oh, all these countries are resource rich, and many of them happen to be independent or happen to have had pretty fierce independence struggles. Even Somalia was on that list, and we know the United States has had a lot of trouble in Somalia. It's tried to suppress Somalia for many, many years. It overthrew the Islamic Courts Union because it couldn't handle any independence in Somalia because it needed Somalia's resources, its geopolitical, geostrategic location. It needed that country to be completely decimated. So all of it is really desperate. It's a really desperate attempt to keep people down, to keep people unable to develop for themselves. But the longer this goes on, the more we see it's just not working and it's not going to last forever. And so what's the plan for the United States? The United States generally doesn't plan. That's not really how finance capital works. That's not how the military industrial complex works. They don't look at, oh, we're planning to address these problems. They usually are just thinking, well, how do we wage this next war? How do we make more return on our investment? Well, there is no plan. The plan is, well, let's hope we can destroy and and suppress and hopefully undermine any attempt to get out from underneath us.
Yep, they have no plan.